Operating expenses in action, part 1. So on the left-hand side of our screen, we have the expenses the seller gave us. And throughout the remainder of the video here, I'm going to show you how I went from what the seller gave us on the left to what we project our expenses are actually going to be on the right. If you want to skip ahead and go to the next video, feel free to do so and use the expenses on the right. Those are the expenses we're going to use moving forward. But stick around if you want to see how I went from the expenses on the left to our projection on the right. As you can see, we started out with about $12,800 in expenses, and that quickly increased to $23,390. Almost doubled. Yeesh. So when you receive expenses from a seller, the first thing you need to do is put them in annual amounts. Looking back at what the seller gave us, everything's pretty much in an annual amount except for trash hauling. That's $95 a month. We can get the annual amount for that by multiplying the monthly amount times 12 months. And there we have it all on the right. All of our sellers' annual expenses. The next thing we need to do is calculate the seller's annual expenses per unit. And you get that by taking the total expense and dividing it by 5, which is the number of units. Cost divided by 5 units equals cost per unit. So going through each of the seller's annual expenses, we can divide it by 5, and on the far right, you see what the seller's per unit cost is. If you recall back from the theory video, looking at expenses on a per unit basis allows you to compare one property to another. Refer back to that video if that concept doesn't sound familiar to you. So moving forward, the only thing we're going to work with is the seller's per unit cost. Everything else we did doesn't matter at this point. We're only going to use the seller's per unit cost, and we're going to use comps to try to determine whether or not that cost per unit looks accurate. So here's where the analysis really kicks in. We have to look for missing expenses, and we need to make sure everything looks accurate. To do that, you need to have a starting point. Here are some typical expense categories at most properties. This may not be all inclusive, but it's a good place to start. Let's start with property taxes. Looking at the seller's expenses, they didn't give us property taxes. Now that one's easy enough to find out. You can call your local tax collector. You may even be able to research it online. Go and get that cost. What we're working towards here is how much are we actually going to pay at this property in the first year that we own it. The estimate you initially saw on the first slide. Once we research the tax expense, we can add that in, and you can see on the far right we have total year 1 estimate. That's how much we discovered that this property will cost each year in taxes. And then for good measure, I also divided it by 5 and got a year 1 per unit. So that was an example of a missing expense. Moving on to property insurance. The seller did give us property insurance at $530 a unit. Now, based on my experience and the comps in this market, I expect property insurance would be closer to $250 to $350 per unit. However, this expense is $530. Why is it so high? The reason could be that it's in a floodplain, or perhaps there's another reason. But since the seller's number is more conservative than mine, I'm going to use their number and assume that I'm going to be paying $530 per unit, which multiplied times 5 units would be $2,650 in the first year. Do you see how I did that? I have some kind of a baseline in my head of what that expense should be based on my experience, based on other properties I looked at, based on other properties I own, based on my conversations with a property manager, and I compare the two, and then I choose which one I want to use in this analysis. I decided to use what the seller gave us, but I just as easily could have used the $250 or $350 per unit that I typically see for this type of property. Moving on to the next one, utilities. There are several utilities identified here. For electricity, the seller indicated they pay about $60 per unit per year. That seems low, but that very well could be for 1 or 2 common area lights. I have no reason to believe otherwise. I'm going to use their number here. And that's something you can try to verify with the utility provider or by looking at the seller's electricity bill. And you can get into all that after you put the property under agreement. But this is what I'm going to go with for now. I should probably mention here that tenants pay their own electric at this property. So like I said before, this is only for common area electric, and maybe for vacant unit electric. The next item is gas. That's $20 per unit. That seems like a very odd cost, but I have no reason to believe otherwise at the moment. I'm going to leave it. The next one's oil for heating. As discussed in the broker's notes when we originally looked at information for this property, the landlord pays for the tenant's heat. This is that cost right here. There's an oil burner in the basement that the landlord's responsible for. At $1,200 per unit, I have no reason to believe it's anything otherwise. I'm going to use the seller's number, which results in $6,000 per year in oil. Just like with electricity and gas, this is something I can try to verify during the due diligence period, assuming the seller accepts our offer. The last one's water and sewer. The seller's telling us it's $220 per unit. I'd expect between $200 and $250 per unit in this market for this type of property. So that number sounds fine to me. I'm going to use the seller's number and move forward. The next category is repair and maintenance. There are 5 items here that make up repair and maintenance. When I look at repair and maintenance, I look at the overall cost, which I'd expect to be around $800 per unit for this type of property. So what I'm going to do is add all those individual items together and combine them into one repair and maintenance line. So all those 5 costs add up to $550 a unit. That's lower than what I'd expect it would be at $800 a unit. So I'm going to go with my number, $800 a unit, and I'm going to multiply that times 5, and that results in an estimate of $4,000 for that expense in year 1. That's how much we think we're going to pay for that expense, and it's higher than what the seller thinks they're paying. The next expense is property management. Let's assume that the property management fee is 6% of effective rent. Looking back at our DCF analysis, we see that effective rent in year 1 is $35,640. $35,640 times 6% is $2,138. Or if you divide that by 5, $428 per unit. The seller didn't give us that number, so let's add it at the bottom. Administrative costs. Often for smaller properties, you really don't have many administrative costs. You may, and by all means take them into account if you do, but I'm fine leaving those off for now. The seller didn't give us any, I'm not going to assume any, and I'm going to leave that as 0 for now. Marketing expenses. For these smaller properties, you don't always have a marketing expense. Perhaps a simple sign you already own out in the front yard works, or perhaps a free online classified ad works, or maybe you had 0 turnover and you didn't even have to market a property. I don't expect to spend much money on marketing, so I'm fine leaving that off this list. However, if you do anticipate spending money on marketing, include an estimate here. And replacement reserves. This is money you set aside for the roof that will one day need to be replaced, the replacement of that oil-powered burner in the basement, parking lot resurfacing, and other stuff. Again, this property was built in the late 1800s, and things will need to be replaced. And many things probably already have been replaced multiple times over the history of this property. This is a tough estimate to make, but let's say based on the condition of this building, we roughly think it's going to cost us $300 per unit per year, and will be covered when we do have to replace those big things down the road. For this and all these other expenses, a property manager is a great resource to get some base data. Don't use any of the numbers I discussed here. This is just me using my inner monologue and trying to walk you through my thought process as I look at a property's expenses. These expenses may be way off from what they are in your market. So again, these are very market and property specific. You need to do your homework and try to figure out what a baseline is for the property you're looking at so you don't make the mistake of underestimating expenses. And that completes task 3. So as we discussed at the beginning of this video, if we look at what the seller gave us on the left and we look at what we estimated on the right, we almost doubled what the seller gave us. If we just went with what the seller gave us, we could have underestimated our expenses by about $11,000. For a property this size, that's a big number. So I hope you see the importance of going through a process like this and analyzing each expense individually and really taking the time to make sure the expenses look accurate. So what are a few other ways to protect yourself from underestimating expenses? We've already seen the cost per unit check in action, at least on the individual expense level, but you can also do it at the overall expense level. Here are the expenses per unit that we came up with. Comparable properties in this market typically run around $3,500 per unit. Why did we overestimate by so much? Well, one of the reasons, and the reason here, is that we're including an expense that the typical property doesn't have. You see, at this property, we're paying for the oil to heat the place. In the pool of properties that make up that $3,500 per unit average, the tenants are paying for their heat. And that's more common in this market. So you get rid of that oil for heating, and you finally have an apples to apples comparison. And we are looking at approximately $3,500 per unit at this property. So I'm feeling pretty good about this number. The next check is the operating expense ratio check. This shows the relationship between operating expenses and effective rent. And you get it by dividing operating expenses by the effective rent. And you can do it by the total amount, or as we're going to do here, we're going to do it by the per unit amount, because we've been working with per units for the last 15 slides. So we're going to divide the operating expenses per unit of $4,678 by the effective rent per unit of $7,128, and that results in 66%. Now that 66% seems high to me. I'd expect to see more like 40, 45, 50% operating expense ratio here. For some reason, this one's so much higher. And either we were overly conservative or we weren't comparing apples to apples. So let's get rid of that oil for heat again, come down to about $3,500 per unit in operating expenses, and divide that by the effective rent per unit, and we get 49%. Now that's more in line with what I'd expect to see. And again, I'm feeling even a little bit better about this number because all these checks are kind of ticking and tying. Now this process we went through and these checks that we did here, this isn't foolproof. You can still make a mistake and underestimate expenses, and you can still make a mistake of overestimating expenses and losing the deal because you got too conservative. But this is the business of real estate investment. This is how pros work, and I hope this opened your eyes a little bit to some of the finer points in real estate investment. So here's where we left off. On the far right is our total year one estimate. This is what we're going to use in the next video when we start putting all this stuff in Excel.